Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very excited to have a return engagement today. So about a year and change ago, we had Kate Eberle Walker on the show. She's the CEO of a company called Presence Learning, and had a great conversation about teletherapy and how to bring services into schools prior to the pandemic. And then 2020 has happened. Would have loved to have Kate back anyway, but in particular, in light of the rapid move of everything online and the real needs around students with special needs or with needs for school psychologists and speech pathologists and all that kind of stuff, there's quite a bit going on that we're going to dive into shortly. But before any of that, Kate, welcome back to Trending in Education.
Thank you for having me back. It's been quite a year since we last spoke.
Oh my goodness. And we were talking about it, and I actually thought it was 2 years, and it was only one, just to show.
Just 1 year. I know. That's how time is moving these days.
Oh my goodness. But for folks who maybe want an abbreviated version of what we talked about last time, can you just catch folks up on who you are, what Presence Learning is, and what you've been focused on since you've been there?
Yes, absolutely. So Presence Learning is the largest provider of teletherapy services to K-12 schools to serve their special education population. Mm-hmm. So we're doing speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral mental health and counseling services, and it's all done online through our teletherapy platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was a real need when we talked about this a year ago. I remember we were talking about like rural America and certain parts of the world that have less access to in-person services like this. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, because Presence Learning, we were founded 11 years ago. So we've been doing this a long time, and the initial need was most prominent, exactly as you describe it, was in very remote rural districts or in some very urban-centered districts who, for different reasons, had a hard time finding and recruiting and retaining the clinicians that you need to do this work. I mean, this work is all performed by speech language pathologists, school psychologists, occupational therapists. These are very competitive hiring fields. It's work that requires very advanced degrees, and you don't always find the professionals in every location, particularly in these very spread out school districts. So we started to help solve that problem. So you had districts that couldn't hire enough of the therapists, so they weren't able to meet their requirements under federal law to provide the therapy to the kids with the special education services needs. So we started working with some of those districts first, and many of them are still our clients today, and continue to grow with them and support their special education teams and serve their students. And that was evolving over time. As in lots of other areas of education, there's increased comfort with technology, increased adoption of online services. And so we've grown over the years to include more large urban districts, more suburban districts, but still always serve that core of rural schools, because that's where the biggest need was. And until March of 2020, when no one would have anticipated that exact need of, we can't get clinicians in the same room with our students, suddenly applied across the entire country.
Yeah. The demand shifted, and everyone was already forced to adopt. So the adoption problem was now gone. Then you have to figure out, how do you start to execute against this enormous need in a new format? So it's not just that they may not have been ready to move online, but then even how you deliver the services online, there's a training component for the workforce as well.
Which is huge. So that exactly. So the conversation with schools changed from trying to convince them to consider online, to try online, to rapid pace jump to, okay, we have to do it online, and we're not sure we know exactly how to do that. Can you help us? And so that it changed a couple of big things for our company. One was just recognizing that suddenly the most valuable thing that we had was not only having our own team of clinicians who were available to serve kids where schools didn't have the staff, but suddenly it was our knowledge, that expertise in how to do this and how to adapt your offline practice to an online modality. And so we expanded our business model really quickly, looking back to March, because we realized not every school is going to want to, they all need to go online, but that doesn't mean that they're all going to want to hire our clinicians to serve their kids. I mean, they have There's large special education staffs in every district across the country. They know the kids, they have their relationships. They're going to want help connecting with their kids, not replacing them. So we changed what we were doing and started focusing on licensing our teletherapy platform and running professional development training sessions. We call it Teletherapy Essentials.
Yeah.
And it's everything you need to know to use the technology to work in the platform, but then also the more qualitative, how do you need to change your approach to what makes for an engaging therapy session? How do you connect with the child through the screen?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm always struck by the parallels between the therapeutic relationship, the clinical relationship, and the teaching dynamic, the teaching relationship. And it seems by virtue of this pandemic, it's all been brought into the home through screens and video chats and all of that. Any perspective on how that transition, especially from the inside, it's in some ways you've already been there, thinking about using this mode, understanding there are benefits as well as its drawbacks, and then this massive transition happens, very suddenly. What have you learned over that period of time?
One of the big things was it really drove home the importance of communication with the home, with the parents, with the other caregivers, and what schools needed to jump to in terms of online service is the most complicated way to do it. So pre-COVID, we had two distinct groups that we served. We served virtual schools who were always needing to tackle that second layer of complexity of not just how do I engage with a student through a screen, but how do I coordinate with the family at home to make sure that service happens. And then there were all of the schools that we were serving in school buildings where you take out that communication piece and you just focus on having that therapy be happening through a screen.
Even physically in the school.
It would be physically happening in the school. So you'd have an aide, you'd have a paraprofessional or another aide who would be picking up the child from their academic classroom, bringing them to a therapy room, bringing them up in front of the screen. So all of those pieces of it were taken care of in the school. So you had two things were changing dramatically. You had that coordination piece of what are all of the calls, emails, instructions, coordination points that need to happen to get that child sitting in front of the screen. And then what do you need to do to engage and have a productive session? So it's really complicated. So I think we knew from working with virtual schools, but we really learned all over again with our schools that you had to get the communication. We've added not just processes, real functionality to our platform in terms of text ability to do text reminders to parents or the at-home caregiver to making the session happen is as important as making it engaging once you're there.
Yeah, a topic we've talked a lot about on this show is digital inclusion. We have expectations, particularly those of us who are connected and online all the time through our smartphones, through fast connections, wherever we go. We have a perception of the world around us that isn't necessarily shared by everyone who's out there. And one of the trends that has really emerged and become more front and center now is that broader awareness that these access gaps exist. Can you talk about how that came into being through the pandemic from your perspective?
Yeah, we certainly see firsthand the dramatic differences in tech equipment, and that's across all areas of academic learning. Schools are grappling with this. We all read these nice headlines about the very large urban districts that might get a corporate donation of thousands of tablets or Chromebooks or laptops. And you read about that sort of system of supplementing and getting technology into the hands of students. We, like you said earlier in this conversation, work with so many smaller, more remote rural districts. They're not necessarily getting these headline generating corporate donations. And there are real challenges there, not only with getting equipment into every home, but having an internet connection. We saw some really great creativity. A lot of schools did something that I thought was really interesting. They took their school buses and equipped them with Wi-Fi broadcasters and drove them, parked them in areas of their communities where they knew there was a need to broadcast a signal, or even have the kids come sit on the bus to do their work. Things like these community solutions are a really big part of keeping education going right now in the country. And then the other thing that we saw a lot of was recognizing that we needed to make it easier for all parents to be able to communicate and understand what was being asked of them and their children, which means having more languages than English.
Mm.
And we put a lot of resource into doing translations of all of our parent resources and guides and instructional materials,
Yeah.
adding more Spanish language speakers in particular to our live support desk so that when those parents call, they can have the direct conversation they need to have. And that's really important in a lot of our districts to have that.
Yeah. It also reminds me of, I forget the exact term from the digital inclusion space, but it's frequently at the community level, the digital navigators are like an aunt or a cousin or someone in your community who can help connect you and maybe update your equipment, or at least just understand how to get access to resources. Is that something you've had experience with on your end?
Definitely. So we do this thing, we would call it a tech check, a technical check that any family member or a student themselves, if they're older, can do that, that we require to happen before the first online therapy session.
Yeah.
And it's just a checkpoint to get to talk to one of our technical guides if you need, and make sure that you're hooking into the right webcam and the audio feed and all of those pieces. And when we do that, the interaction point is often a household member other than the parent or the student is the one that's making sure that everything is set up and ready to go.
Yeah. We take a lot of stuff for granted at times, but then on the other side, so that's this massive forcing function of the pandemic. People have to move online. We're more increased demand for school services around psychology, teletherapy. We want to talk about school evaluations and some of those things in a second. But at the same time, the amount of psychological stress that everyone is under is through the roof as well. So I do imagine if you were already diagnosed with special needs, obviously you're feeling the stress and it's more likely going to manifest in ways that are problematic. And then if you hadn't been diagnosed and you were having some behavioral problems, it's not like the pandemic is easing your stress load and making you less likely to have behavioral health problems. Have you seen that increase on the other side as well? I imagine schools are even having trouble just operating, let alone shifting all these services. How's it been on that side?
Yeah, in terms of there's a growing need for general mental health and wellness services for all students, right? Not only the students with special education needs. And that area, that was a need before the pandemic, and now it's growing, and it's always been a tough area for schools. They have so many requirements and baseline services that they need to meet. And all of that has become more logistically complicated this year. And so to get the breathing room and the funding room that you need to be able to run some of these mental health wellness programs is challenging. So what we've tried to do this year is create contained tactical programming so that schools can do something, start with something that's manageable as they figure out how to build up these programs. Like we've been doing more small group counseling programs. We partnered with a group called Eye Opening Enterprises that does trauma-informed counseling work. And so they built a program for us that's amazing. It's called Finding Your Superpower in Uncertain Times. And it really, and it's for middle schoolers, it's for high schoolers, and it builds a program around, talking about what's going on right now, the lack of consistency in schedules and routines, the social isolation, the economic uncertainty. Many children are in families where a parent has lost a job or been furloughed or something to that effect. Talking about the racial protests and how kids are processing that. So it's this program that is just meant to, in a series of weekly counseling sessions, help kids process and find their way. So we've been trying to do more things like that are a small bite, something that you can start with, try to do some things. So that's been interesting. I hope to see more schools able to do that and able to expand beyond the required programs into some of these areas. The other thing that's happening is there's a lot of children who haven't been evaluated. They're waiting to be evaluated to see if they do have a need or a disability or some challenge needs to be addressed. And that a lot of that, the majority of that evaluation assessment work really stopped. It just came to a
Yeah.
halt
Right.
last spring. And
Yeah.
that builds up. Like those issues don't go away.
Hmm.
And so you have children waiting to even get evaluated, to
Right.
get a recommendation for what they need. And that, like the tumbleweed that
Yeah.
builds and gets
Yeah.
bigger and bigger. You just kept having more and more build up coming into this year. And a lot of districts, working with a lot of districts right now to help them work through that, get caught up, get back
Hmm.
on track. I think that there was really, it was such a new idea back in the spring, this idea of doing those assessments online.
Hmm.
We've been doing them for the past 5 years, again, with those rural districts that were asking to do it
Yeah.
because they couldn't get the school psychologist to
Hmm.
come on site, but they knew they needed to get the evaluations done. We built this telepractice in the assessment area,
Yeah.
working with the publishers, but it was very unfamiliar to
Hmm.
the majority of the people in schools across the country who were being
Hmm.
asked to conduct these assessments. So
Hmm.
it's taken a lot of conversation, a lot of really debate to try to convince people that it's better to assess than not, and keep kids waiting.
Yeah, exactly. And it does feel like that the forcing function of the pandemic has moved us forward in our thinking about digital in a lot of really interesting ways. Do you have any perspective on what on the other side? Let's say the vaccine hopefully rolls out and we go back closer to normal by,
Yeah.
say, summer into the end of 2021. How much do you think methods we've adopted that are more convenient or more scalable or more connected, all those things I think are true when it comes to teletherapy and telepractice more broadly? How much do you think we shift back, or how much do you think we just stay in that new mode?
I think there's so many advantages that are being recognized
Hmm.
during this period that
Hmm.
I can't imagine it all going back to how it was in a few different ways. The biggest one for me is what it allows the workforce to do. We've always had our team of clinicians who were choosing teletherapy, and a lot of that was about choosing the flexibility and schedule control that comes from working remotely. And this field, particularly speech language pathologists, they're majority, 97% women.
Mm.
A lot of them are of an age where they have young children and they
Hmm.
have household responsibilities they're trying to manage as well. And we'd created this way to work for some, and now a lot more are getting to experience it.
Hmm.
That shows them that they can, they can manage their lives and manage their work and do the work they love and still engage with children, but not have to leave their homes every day
Yeah.
and be beholden to somebody else's schedule. So I think that's a huge change.
Mm.
I think that's happening. It's happening in my own company. It's happening in
Yeah.
probably everybody's company, right? This window into what works well and what's nicer for lifestyle for a lot
Hmm.
of employees.
Hmm.
So there's that element of it, but then there's actually just doing that work, engaging with the child online.
Yeah.
Kids respond often
Mm-hmm.
to technology. They like watching videos, they
Hmm.
like playing
Mm.
interactive games. And clinicians get to, instead of planning to bring a bunch of toys, games, options carried in a box to a therapy room, they get to organize these really fun therapy cues online of pulling the videos and the games and the activities and the flashcards, everything kind of in
Yeah.
an online lineup that's there, like a playlist for
Hmm.
them to
Hmm.
run their therapy sessions. It's fun, it's easier, it's very engaging. If something's not working for a child, you can X that out, go to the next thing. It's more nimble, I would say. It
Hmm.
allows for the therapy sessions to be kind of more nimble to find what's going to engage the child. So I think that's going to stick no matter what the format. This idea of using online tools to supplement the therapy and the engagement, I think that's definitely here to stay.
Yeah, and to your point, I do think I've thought more about this on the teaching side, but I think it's similar in the more clinical or assessment side, is that the scale with which everyone is experimenting
Hmm.
with the online delivery is going to lead to more innovation, and in particular, if you're able to share what's working amongst like a community of practice, which
Yeah.
it seems like you have that opportunity at Presence Learning because you're so connected into the practitioners of this stuff. How are you thinking about those types of jobs in the future as we start looking a little bit further ahead? What do you see on the horizon for jobs like speech pathologists or occupational therapists or school psychologists? Any window into what you might see on the horizon for that type of work?
I definitely think in the, not just in the school sector, but the private practice
Hmm.
sector, more and more of that profession is moving online
Hmm.
because you're thinking about directly what do parents want, what are parents comfortable with.
Yeah.
And I think we're in the early stages of piloting a private practice version of our therapy platform.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of pickup and excitement and embracing of the online modality in private
Hmm.
practice. So I think that's going to be a big trend. And I think that for school professionals, you just hit on this idea of having a community of experts
Hmm.
sharing best practices. That's just being discovered in a new way. We had, coming into the pandemic, we had about 1,000 clinicians. It was already this kind of great community that were sharing what worked for them, sort of tips, tricks, resources.
Yep.
Now we have about 8,000 clinicians
Hmm.
using the platform. We've grown our own team, plus we're training and licensing the platform to school teams. So that's a huge
Yeah.
group to
Hmm.
really pull from, find out. Every day we're getting a new idea, a new suggestion for which assessments they'd like to have integrated into the platform, which activities they're going to other sites to pull from that
Hmm.
we can make easier for them to access, and so on. And so you have this a lot of energy. We started running these clinical workshops for our presence learning community of providers, and someone will run a session on something that they have experience in, a specialty of theirs, and just invite others to join. And when you have thousands of people, you always get a really engaged group that just
Hmm.
wants to learn and push their own practice forward. So I think it starts to get into a different kind of continuing education, professional development, almost
Yeah.
this idea of the sort of sharing and sourcing across the group.
Yeah, it's interesting when you start meeting the tremendous demand that is out there, and also any stigma associated with mental health or reaching out for those types of services seems to be waning a little bit these days. I was talking to someone recently who said, if you're not anxious nowadays, there's probably something wrong with you. And then also understanding when it's serious enough that you do need help, which is the other reason why I very much appreciate that there are organizations like Presence Learning out there that are making sure that the services are trauma informed, that in the event that there's a real problem, you have
Mhm.
more of a safety net of a community that's built in to make sure that these services that really are essential services are delivered in resilient ways that are also sensitive to the
Right.
needs of the individual and the family.
Yeah, yeah. And you have to take a really different approach, maybe a more deliberate approach to the risk spotting and identification and the coordinated action plan when we're doing a new implementation in any school. One of the first things we need to do is establish the emergency plan. If one of
Hmm.
our therapists through the screen sees a dangerous behavior
Right.
or signal, who do they alert? And
Mm.
sometimes that can be very little, right? Like we had an example of a child who's playing with matches,
Mm.
and you're not in the room, but you're
Right.
certainly gonna, you see it, you certainly are gonna act
Yeah.
swiftly to address it. But
Yeah.
it takes a little more planning and process and coordination to make sure that if and when things like that happen, that
Yeah.
you can still take full responsibility.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you start thinking through. I hadn't thought of the child with matches example. That's a great one. I was thinking also more the positive aspect of the boundaries that are built into
Yeah. Mhm.
online. Can you expand on that a little?
I think the biggest thing, that there is a natural boundary, right? There's a safety, I think,
Hmm.
on all sides from not having the physical dynamic
Yeah, right.
along with the emotional. And I think the biggest thing it does is really leads to more opening up and
Yeah.
more comfort, more honesty,
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
even because there's a different feeling of engagement. There's also more of a feeling of anonymity,
Yeah,
which, and I know people talk about in other online contexts, there can be maybe a meanness that comes from
right,
anonymity and what people
right.
might post on social media that they
Hmm.
wouldn't say to somebody. But in a one-on-one
Yeah,
online session, or looking at each other on a screen,
yeah,
but having the comfort that you're talking to someone who doesn't live in your community, isn't
right,
going to run into your mom at the
right.
grocery store.
Yeah.
It really does allow for still a nice relationship to build without some of those worries.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like a house call in a sense too, which is another. I've always thought how this is helping the agoraphobic and people who are more just socially anxious, who
Hmm.
don't even want to go out to the appointment, like going through
Right.
the travel to get to the place where you're going to be evaluated. I imagine we can begin to reach people who otherwise wouldn't have had.
Yeah. Something that was an obstacle doesn't
Yeah,
have to be a
yeah.
factor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So lots of good stuff on the horizon there. And then whenever we have our guests, we always like to know any other things you're noticing, any other hot tips, or looking into your crystal ball for the future.
I'll start with just one more on the special education
Yeah.
and therapy topic, which is we've talked a bit more about the parent involvement, the family involvement in
Hmm.
education. But I'll say both in my work for Presence Learning and in other board work, advisory work around the sector, I think the parent as a secondary customer
Mm,
for education and as an influencer and an involved participant, I think
mm,
that trend is going to drive a lot of things. And I think
mhm,
every company, including ours, we don't sell our service directly to parents, but
mhm,
we are certainly thinking more actively about what we need to do to engage them, because engaging the parent and having
mm,
their support in whatever you're trying to do across
mhm.
education is just so critical. And I think that's just a big topic that I
Yeah.
think is interesting. And for me, having come from
Mhm,
Kaplan, Princeton Review, these companies that did directly serve parents as
mhm.
the consumer, and now being over in the school world, I think it's just to me really exciting to think about
Yeah.
having parents get more active,
Yeah.
and I think as a company thinking about how you can educate parents and make sure that they have all the information they need.
Yeah, it's especially interesting if you think about what we were talking about before, where the services are delivered into the home. The
Hmm.
parent may be sitting next to her child while you're setting up for the session. There's a level of intimate connection that the televersion of therapy has because you're delivering into people's homes and the parents are
Yeah.
there.
My one of my daughters receives occupational therapy and speech therapy online, and
Hmm.
I know the therapists
Hmm.
personally, and because I get to
Right.
say hi to them every week.
Yeah.
And traditionally, that was happening inside the school day, and the parent had much less visibility
Yeah.
into, or just much less time
Yeah.
or access to that person. So that's, from a parent perspective, it's really nice, but it's also, I know our therapists love it. They love the work where they get to have more
Yeah.
direct access to the parent, because they know that's so key in making sure that you reach the child
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'm maybe 2021 is the year of the parent
or
in
the parent.
education. I like that. I like that. Thank you for that. Yeah, and then how about for you on the horizon? I heard you might be working on a project.
Yes, I have a book coming out in March of 2021. It's called The Good Boss: 9 Ways Every Manager Can Support Women at Work.
Hmm.
So I believe, from my own career trajectory and from talking to a lot of other successful women, that the biggest difference in a woman's career trajectory is really her boss. And if you have a
Hmm.
good boss who sees your potential, who clears obstacles for you, who gives you stretch opportunities, that can just have all the difference in where you end up. So I wrote this book that gives, very practical advice to all managers
Hmm.
of women, particularly male managers, because that's the majority of managers today, how to understand the working experience of the women who work for you, and practical things you can do to smooth the path.
Yeah, so definitely piqued my interest, and I imagine our audience's collective interest. So if that's coming out in March, there may be an opportunity to get Kate back to go deeper on some of those tips, which sound super interesting. If folks want to learn anything more about presence learning or any of the stuff we talked about today, where should they go?
Presencelearning.com. You
There
can
you
come to
go.
our site. There's a lot of
Yeah.
videos, a lot of ways to reach our teams from there to get more information.
Yeah, and I know you're out there more on podcasts, and you're an interesting follow on LinkedIn. So I would
Please, yes. Eberle
recommend.
Walker at
Yeah,
LinkedIn. Yep.
yeah, exactly. So, Kate, thanks so much for coming back to Trending in Education. It was wonderful to have you back. And for our listeners, thanks as always for listening. We'll be back again soon. If you like what you're hearing, tell a friend, write a review, share us. This is Trending in Education.